Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a listener submission about a tragic incident in Tulum, Mexico.
Ah.
The deaths of the Sharp family while on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
You shared a podcast episode with us that presents an alternative theory
Right.
about what happened, and we're here to help you sort through it all.
It's a heartbreaking case, and the podcast definitely raises some interesting questions about the official explanation.
Right. Like, the official reports conclude that the family died from accidental asphyxiation due to a propane leak,
Yeah.
but the podcast host lays out a pretty compelling case against that theory.
So let's start with what we know.
Okay.
The Sharp family, a family of 4 from Iowa, was found in their third-floor condo.
Right.
The authorities attributed their deaths to a propane leak
Mm-hmm.
from a faulty water heater.
Okay.
On the surface, it seems like a tragic accident.
Right.
But the podcast host argues there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical of this conclusion.
Yeah, like the fact that propane is heavier than air. If the leak was on the third floor with open windows and the family moving in and out, wouldn't it be really difficult for the gas to build up to lethal levels?
You're right to question that.
Yep.
It's one of the key points the podcast makes.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. Imagine propane as a dense fog that clings to the ground.
Okay.
It wouldn't easily rise to the third floor,
Okay.
and any that did would likely dissipate quickly with open windows.
That makes sense, yeah. And there's also the issue of the smell.
Right?
I mean, propane has that incredibly strong rotten egg odor because of the additive, mercaptan.
Exactly.
So,
The podcast argues that if there was a significant leak,
yeah.
the smell would have been overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that the Sharps wouldn't have noticed it,
Right.
especially with young children who might be more sensitive to strong smells.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And the podcast doesn't stop there. They also highlight some other puzzling aspects of the investigation.
Right, like the speed with which the authorities reached their conclusion.
Yeah.
The family was informed of the cause of death just a day after the bodies were found.
Wow.
That seems awfully quick for such a complex investigation.
Yeah, and to add to the suspicion,
Mm-hmm.
the podcast points out the lack of photographic evidence
Yeah.
of the alleged leak.
Yeah.
All we see are pictures of the surrounding area and tourist attractions,
Yeah.
but nothing that actually shows a damaged water heater
Right.
or any sign of a leak.
It does make you wonder why those crucial images weren't released if they existed.
Right.
It almost seems like you're trying to avoid drawing attention to the details of the condo itself.
Okay, this is where I really started to get hooked.
Oh, yeah.
The podcast brings up a Canadian tourist,
Okay.
Todd Johnson,
Yeah.
who stayed at the same complex.
Mm.
He actually reported smelling gas in his unit
Oh, wow.
and was so concerned that he shut off his propane supply completely.
That's an interesting detail.
Right.
If this tourist could detect gas in his unit,
Yeah.
it raises questions about the overall safety practices
Yeah.
and maintenance at the complex.
Yeah.
It's hard to ignore the possibility that there might have been wider issues beyond just a single faulty water heater.
Yeah. It's certainly a disturbing thought.
It is.
And here's where the podcast takes a sharp turn
Okay.
and presents its most explosive theory.
Right. They suggest that foul play might be involved
Whoa.
and that the propane leak story is a cover-up
Okay.
to protect the region's tourism industry.
That's a serious accusation.
Yes.
And to back it up, they even bring up bomb threats that
Yeah.
were made against ferries in the area around the same time,
Right.
creating this ominous sense of danger and conspiracy.
It's a dramatic twist, for sure.
Yeah.
And before we jump to any conclusions,
Yeah.
we need to take a step back
Okay.
and analyze the evidence.
Right.
Just because the thing seems suspicious. It doesn't automatically mean there's a sinister plot at play.
You're right. We need to keep a level head
Mm-hmm.
and approach this with a critical eye.
Exactly.
Go.
It's important to consider all the angles and
Yeah.
potential explanations.
Right.
Was the investigation flawed,
Mm-hmm.
or is there something more nefarious going on?
Well, let's dive deeper into the podcast's claims and
So-
see where the evidence leads us.
Sounds good. One of the things the podcast emphasizes is the lack of signs of struggle in the condo.
Right.
They point out that there was no forced entry
Uh-huh.
and that the family's bodies seemed peaceful,
Yeah.
almost as if they were sleeping.
That's a chilling detail.
Yeah.
But then the podcast takes that observation
Right.
and uses it to support a truly shocking theory
Yep.
that the family might have been murdered elsewhere
Oh, wow.
and then staged in the condo,
Okay.
perhaps even killed in their rental car.
It's a bold claim,
Yeah.
and I can see how it would capture the listener's imagination. However, we need to be cautious about jumping to such conclusions.
Yeah.
Just because something seems strange or out of place doesn't automatically mean foul play is involved.
That's true.
Yeah.
But then they bring up another detail that struck me as odd.
Okay.
The fact that the police mentioned the family's rental car being full of sand,
Right.
implying they had been to the beach before returning to the condo.
Yeah.
Why would the police even mention that detail?
It is a bit puzzling,
Yeah.
and the podcast seizes on that,
Okay.
questioning why the police were even searching the rental car in the first place.
Right.
They present this as further evidence that something just doesn't add up.
It's like they're suggesting the police might be trying to divert attention or plant a seed of doubt in people's minds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The podcast then delves into some cultural observations,
Okay.
pointing out how the police describe the children as being found in front of the television.
Right.
The host argues that this detail seems outdated and unlikely. Given how common iPads and smartphones are these days,
Right.
they imply that the Mexican authorities might be out of touch with typical American family behavior.
It's like they're questioning the authenticity of the police report.
Yeah.
Suggesting the details might have been fabricated to fit a narrative.
Precisely.
Okay.
The podcast also highlights another curious detail from the police report. The mention of the air conditioning in the condo slowing down the decomposition of the bodies,
Okay.
making it harder to pinpoint the exact time of death.
Why would they even include that information?
Right.
It just seems random and unnecessary.
The podcast host certainly sees it that way.
Yeah.
They view it as another attempt by the authorities to be vague and evasive,
Right.
further fueling their suspicion of a cover-up.
Okay, here's another detail the podcast latches onto.
Okay.
The Sharks were scheduled to check out of their condo on March 21st and return their rental car.
Yeah.
The podcast points out that renters at the complex typically left their keys in the condo instead of returning them to a reception desk.
That's an interesting point.
So why didn't anyone go to the condo to clean it or check on the family when they didn't check out?
Right.
The podcast finds it suspicious that the maids who supposedly had keys didn't discover the bodies.
Yeah.
They argue that this raises further questions about the timeline of events and whether the authorities are being completely transparent.
It does seem like a logical inconsistency.
Yeah.
The podcast then goes on to emphasize the involvement of multiple levels of law enforcement, municipal, state, and federal
Wow.
in the investigation.
Okay.
They even quote the police chief stating that this was the first time anything like this had happened in the area,
Right.
and emphasizing that Tulum is a safe place for tourists.
The podcast host, of course, interprets this as a blatant attempt to downplay the severity of the incident and reassure tourists, even if it means sacrificing transparency and a thorough investigation.
They're suggesting that economic interests might be taking precedence over a genuine search for the truth.
And then they circle back to the Canadian tourist, Todd Johnson,
Right.
the one who smelled gas in his unit and shut off his propane.
Right.
The podcast uses his experience to cast doubt on the official claim
Yeah.
that a propane leak on the third floor wouldn't have been possible
Right.
if Johnson could detect gas in his unit.
Yeah.
It stands to reason that the Sharps could have as well.
And they remind us that propane has that strong, unmistakable odor for a reason,
Right.
to alert people to potential leaks.
Exactly.
They argue that it's highly unlikely the Sharps would have just ignored such a strong smell,
Right.
especially with young children in tow.
They're building a case for a deliberate cover-up, suggesting the authorities are downplaying or even ignoring key evidence and witness testimonies
Right.
to maintain the image of Tulum as a safe and secure tourist destination.
And to really drive home the point that this wasn't just an isolated incident, they bring up the bomb threats on the ferries, again, linking them to the Sharps' deaths, and creating a sense of widespread danger and an underlying conspiracy in the region.
So what does this all mean? Are we buying into a conspiracy theory?
It's certainly a dramatic and unsettling narrative,
Yeah.
but the question remains, how credible is it?
Right.
We've presented you with the key arguments and evidence presented by the podcast. Now it's time to take a step back and critically analyze what we've learned.
It's easy to get swept up in these alternative narratives, especially when they're presented with such conviction.
Right.
You know, our brains are wired to look for patterns and explanations.
Yeah.
And sometimes we might even see connections where none exist.
That's the challenge with any kind of investigation, whether it's a true crime podcast or a formal inquiry.
Right.
It's about sifting through the noise
Yeah.
and separating fact from speculation.
Okay.
We need to evaluate the sources of information, be mindful of potential biases,
Right.
and constantly look for evidence that either supports or refutes the claims being made.
So in this case, we have the official investigation,
Right.
which the podcast is quick to dismiss as a cover-up.
Yep.
And then we have the podcast host's interpretation,
Right.
which relies heavily on circumstantial evidence and their own deduction.
Exactly. It's important to acknowledge that we're working with limited information.
Right.
We don't have access to the complete investigative files, forensic reports, or witness testimonies.
Okay.
We're relying on what has been made public,
Right.
both by the authorities and the podcast host.
Okay, so how do we navigate this gray area?
Yeah.
What questions should we be asking ourselves as we try to process this information?
Well, for starters,
Yeah.
we need to consider the motives of everyone involved.
Okay.
It's entirely possible that the authorities might be motivated to protect the tourism industry,
Right.
especially in a region where it's so vital to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
But does that automatically mean they would fabricate an entire story about a propane leak?
And what about the podcast host? They clearly believe there's a cover-up.
Yeah.
But could there be any bias in their presentation? Are they genuinely seeking the truth?
Yeah.
Or are they perhaps sensationalizing the story to captivate their audience?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
It's crucial to consider whether they might be selectively highlighting evidence that supports their theory while downplaying or ignoring anything that contradicts it.
It's like that old saying, there are 3 sides to every story.
Yeah.
Yours, mine, and the truth, which often lies somewhere in between.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And in this case, it's possible there's more to the story than either side is letting on.
Right.
Perhaps there were genuine mistakes or oversights in the official investigation, or maybe there's critical information that hasn't been made public
Right.
for reasons we can only speculate about.
So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway for our listeners who are trying to make sense of this tragic case?
The goal of this deep dive wasn't to provide you with definitive answers.
Oh, okay.
It was to present the key arguments and evidence
Yeah.
from the podcast you shared.
Right.
And encourage you to think critically about what you've heard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe this deep dive has sparked your curiosity to do some more digging on your own.
Yeah.
What other information is out there about this case?
Right.
Are there any independent investigations or expert opinions that could shed more light on the situation?
We've given you a starting point.
Yeah.
Now it's up to you to decide what you believe.
Maybe you're still asking yourself, what really happened to the Sharp family?
Right.
That's the beauty of a deep dive like this.
Yeah.
We're not here to tell you what to think.
Mm-hmm.
We're giving you the tools to explore the complexities of this case.
Right.
And reach your own conclusions.
Exactly.
And who knows, maybe your research will uncover something new that changes the entire narrative.
Never know.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
And remember,
Yeah.
keep asking questions, keep searching for answers, and never stop learning.